Hi folks, welcome back to Statistics. Today we are starting Unit 6, and Unit 6 is on sampling distributions. So we need to go over a little bit of information. So sampling distributions is the introduction to inference, which is going to be the last theme we're going to hit here. All right, so we just kind of have to get a little bit of definition stuff out of the way. So hopefully we remember that like the population is where we take the sample from, and the sample is just a small part of the population. The population is the whole. Like anyone we could have surveyed is the population, and the sample is the people that we actually survey, and the sample is generally smaller than the population. So what happens is we take a sample, we collect some data from that sample. Hopefully that sample is a random sample and it's unbiased and it represents the population. And we get from that sample, we get statistics like the mean and the standard deviation, or like the median or some other things, who knows. But we get those bits of information, and then we want to use those informations to try and make some sort of conclusion, or what we call an inference, about the population. So we take a sample, collect the data, run some statistics on it, and then we use that information to make inferences about the whole population again. And this process is called statistical inference. All right, we talked about this at the very beginning of the year when we were guessing like how many M&Ms would be in a bag if we got another bag of M&Ms based on our bag of M&Ms. All right, so it's drawing a conclusion about a population from a sample. It's the fourth domain of statistics. All right, so but the problem here is that every sample, every different sample that we take, every sample would be different if it's a random sample, would lead to different sample statistics. So we would have different means and different standard deviations from every single sample. All right, so this brings in the idea of what we call a sampling distribution, which I'll define later on. But we're going to use this sampling distribution thing, which is the distribution of all possible statistic values. I guess there it is right there. We're going to use that to make to find information about the population, to make a statistical inference. All right, so just a little refresher here. So remember, we use the word parameter when we're talking about a population, mean, or standard deviation. So population parameters would be mu, mean, or mu sub x, like mu with an x means the mu of whatever x it is we're working with, our variable x. Standard deviation for a population is sigma, or sigma sub x, the standard deviation of the variable x. And we can also talk about proportions, like when we work with percents of something, that's a proportion. That would also be for a population, so these would be population parameters. When we talk about a sample, we use the word statistic instead, so it's a number that describes something from a sample. So sample statistics, for the mean, we use x with a little line over it. We call that x bar, is how we usually say that. Standard deviation, we usually use s, or s sub x, the standard deviation of the variable x. And if we're working with a percent, it's p hat. So we call that p hat. We put this little hat on it. It's like like that, p hat. All right, so what happens with a sampling distribution? So this first one is not a sampling distribution. So I just want to put that out there. ING, sampling distribution. So that is not one. This is just a sample of size n equals 100. So this is one sample of 100 pennies randomly selected from a big tub of pennies that I have in my classroom. And we just recorded the dates, and they go back from like 60s all the way up to like 2019, I think is the most recent. And like we can just think about this distribution as being kind of like this. A bit there, and then we have a really high peak over here, and then like that. All right, so it's definitely skewed to the left. All right, so it definitely has some skewing going on here, and it's going to have a very wide spread because it goes from way down there to all the way up there, so it's very spread out. The mean of it is right there, though. All right, so the mean's kind of it's closer to these peaks over here, and where there's a big bunch of data here, but these numbers down here, they pull it down some. All right, so then we bring in the idea of a sampling distribution. So it's the distribution of lots of samples. So in other words, we have 75 samples of size 5. So our n here, our sample size, is 5. So people were asked to take 5 pennies and find the average date of those 5 pennies. And each of these dots is the average of 5 pennies. Now notice it only goes from like 1980 to the 2000s. So it's not nearly as wide as the other one was. So the other one was way out from there to basically the same spot here, but it's not nearly as wide. All right? And if we kind of draw this guy, like it does have some peaks and valleys and stuff, and the little last guy there, but it's getting closer to being symmetric. So the mean looks like it's still about the same place, right? So the mean is still right about there. All right, and we could almost say it's symmetric, all right, because we have about the same. I mean, we have a little more maybe on this side, but it's not bad as far as symmetry goes. All right, and I know it says 65 here. There were more samples added later, so it is 75. All right, then we move on to taking 75 samples of size 20. So here now our sample size is 20, and we're taking 75 samples. And each dot is the mean of a sample. All right, so now look, we don't have anything below 1990. We don't have anything above 2010. Right here we have our mean, which looks like it's at the same spot as it was for all the other ones. But now the distribution it's getting closer and closer to a normal distribution. Like it's not there yet, but it's also a lot less spread out. So the spread is decreasing the whole time here. So like we had very spread out to still pretty spread out to less spread out. So the things to notice here is that the mean of each one stays right in the middle, and the spread gets smaller and smaller as the sample size gets larger and larger. Like this one has samples of size 1, this one you can think of as samples of size 5, and this one would be samples of size 20. So as the sample size increases, the spread decreases. All right, so what are problems going to look like, and what exactly is a sampling distribution? So the sampling distribution is a distribution of many, or all actually, samples of the same size taken from the same population. So from this, they are the same size and they're taken from the same population. All right, and then we'd look at like the mean of all of them, and we'd make a graph of where all those means go. Right, and that's what would be the sampling distribution. So for instance, if we took 75 samples of size 20 pennies are taken from a large tub full of pennies, the mean is calculated for each sample of 200 pennies. Then we would say that the sample size here, our n, is 20. Each sample was 20. And then the number of samples that we took would be the 75. We took 75 samples. All right, so that's what makes this a sampling distribution, that we're taking many samples. So this makes it a sampling distribution. I mean, it's not a complete sampling distribution, but it's a start. A complete sampling distribution would mean we'd take all possible samples of size 20 from that giant tub that I have of pennies in my classroom, which has like 2,000 pennies in it. All right, so some properties of sampling distributions. So the mean of the sampling distribution is the same as the mean of the population. So if we can find the mean for the sampling distribution, that tells us the mean for the population. That's a neat trick we have. And if we know the mean of the population, we can go back and we can say, where's the middle of the sampling distribution going to be? That's the mean. All right, the standard deviation for the sampling distribution is always less than the standard deviation of the population. And it's less than the standard deviation of the sample. All right, so that this gives us less and less spread, and that's what we want. We want this sampling distribution to be less and less spread out, and it'll be closer and closer to the mean, and it tells us where the mean is. It's a nice little trick we've got. So the larger the sample, the smaller the sampling standard deviation. So as the sample size gets bigger, the standard deviation for the sampling distribution gets smaller. That's what we want. We'll have formulas for this next section here. And the larger the samples, the more likely sampling distribution is normal. So if we get large enough samples, we end up with a normal sampling distribution, which means we can use normal CDF, and we can use inverse norm and do all sorts of fun things because of those two things, which we'll see in Unit 7. All right, so a little bit of notation here, and that's it. This is the last thing here. All right, so mu sub x bar. So I'll usually write it like this, mu with an x bar. So the mean of all of the x bars is what that is. It's the mean of the sampling distribution of all the sample means. And if we do sigma with a little x bar, that's the standard deviation for this sampling distribution. So it's the standard deviation of all the sample means. So not of like the samples or the population, but of the sample means. Mu sub p hat is the middle of all the proportions from a sampling distribution of proportions. And standard deviation sub p hat is the standard deviation of the sampling distribution of all the p hats. All right, so some other terms that we sometimes hear here are unbiased estimator. So the mean of the sampling distribution is equivalent to the true mean of the parameter as long as the statistic used to estimate is unbiased. So in other words, as long as we're taking a random sample. So we need a random sample happening here. We'll talk more about that later. And the variability of a statistic is described by the spread of its sampling distribution. All right, so again, larger samples gives smaller spread. So the standard deviation gets smaller with the sample size. It doesn't care at all about the population. So the population, the size of the population, does not affect the standard deviation at all. There is this little 10 times larger thing, but we're not going to worry about that right now. All right, so that's it. So it's just some definitions today. The homework, I believe, was 10 questions. The first 4 are just defining, or the first 6 are just defining things. So check that out, get that done, please, and we'll go over some of them in class.